There's more to a conversation than just the words people say. Juliana Schroeder is an associate professor in management and psychology at the University of California at Berkeley's Haas School of Business. Her latest research quantifies how our assumptions shape and often distort what people are trying to say to us. And Juliana Schroeder joins us now from Berkeley, California to explain. It's great to have you with us. How are you doing tonight?
I'm doing great. Thanks so much for having me, Steve.
Not at all. I want to go back to something that you wrote nearly a decade ago, in which you said the greatest voyage in modern life is not to move from one place to another, but rather to be able to move from one mind to another. Help us understand what you meant by that.
Well, Marcel Proust wrote in 1692, that is the greatest distance to traverse is not that of geographic distance, but it's the distance between two minds. And I think that's absolutely true, that all of our social worlds involve trying to figure out what is going on in other people's minds in order to coordinate with others and understand others. And it's the biggest challenge that we have in the modern world right now, is trying to recognize other people's mental capacities, to read their mental states, and that we fail to do that effectively all the time.
Do you have any theories as to why, given that quote comes from several hundred years ago, we don't seem to have gotten any better at this over all of that time?
Well, I think we actually have gotten a little bit better, but it almost feels like two steps forward, one step back, in a sense, because technology has improved some of that for us. The fact that you and I can talk right now in this video-mediated technology is amazing, and we can try to understand each other's minds a little bit through this conversation. But at the same time, technology can be a barrier as well, because it's not built very well for having intimate, deep understanding of each other, especially when you look at something like social media.
But it's better than nothing, right?
I think it is better than nothing. That's right. But I think that we need to be wise in the way that we build it and the way that we use it. And I don't think we're being very wise right now.
Okay, in this polarized political climate, what role does how we read other people's minds, especially those minds that we disagree with, how does that play?
Well, when we try to think about another person's mind, we first start by trying to integrate kind of two sets of information. We use the top-down cues that we have, like stereotypes about a person, and we egocentrically project. We project what's in our own mind. And then we also try to use these bottom-up cues, whatever it is that the person's actually saying or doing. And so we're trying to integrate those two different sets of information. And sometimes we do this in a way that's not very effective. And in particular, if we don't have a lot of cause to care a lot about other people's minds, our default tendency is to what we call dehumanize them, which is just to kind of assume that there's not much going on up there at all. And so we might tend to rely more on the top-down information, like the stereotypes, and a little bit less on trying to actually integrate like sort of complex, nuanced information about what a person might be thinking.
Doesn't that just perfectly describe most political engagement over the past 10 years?
Yeah, we talk about the default of dehumanization all the time, and how there's a backwards attribution process that happens if a person disagrees with you. So you think of them as being part of a different group, and you could assume that maybe you have different sources of information, or you're thinking about the world differently. Those are reasonable inferences that you might make. That's actually not what people do. They instead think, oh, if you're thinking about something differently than I do, then you must be thinking about it the wrong way. So you're assuming that we kind of start from the same information, but you think that the other person has faulty assumptions and faulty mental capacities, and then you start to generalize that into thinking that their minds are kind of not working the right way at all. And so that leads you to the dehumanization.
What is the lesser mind's problem?
The lesser mind's problem is that default of dehumanization, the idea that because we don't have direct access into other people's minds, we are quick to kind of jump to the conclusion that there's not a lot going on in other people's minds, and that other people have these weak mental capacities. And that is a default assumption that we make, and we call it the lesser mind's problem, because it kind of plays out in all of these different ways in our society.
Do you know why we tend to do that?
It's because it takes a lot of mental capacity, and it takes a lot of work actually to kind of think carefully about other people's minds, particularly other people that are different from us. And that's not the kind of, humans are cognitive misers. And that's not the kind of capacity that we have to kind of think about other people all the time. And so that creates this challenge, this kind of default assumption of just assuming that there's other people don't have much going on. I think it's easy to think about everyone in the world as cardboard cutouts and to think of oneself as having these kind of complex thoughts and feelings. And so that's kind of the default.
Well, we had author Anand Giridharadas on the program just before you, and he sees a culture of quote unquote write-off where we tend to see people in monolithic ways and not as complicated people or even contradictory people, and therefore unpersuadable. His view is that one of the biggest problems happening in North America, well, in the Western world today, is that people are unpersuadable. Does your research overlap with that contention?
I think that our findings are largely consistent with that, that we tend to think of others in this sort of simplistic way and not read them carefully. And unless we're triggered to do so, we are quick to jump to this default conclusion that others that think differently than us are either stupid or they have bad intention. And therefore, it's not worth even trying to persuade them and even trying to get them to understand.
I wonder if I wonder if one of the reasons we do that is that it's simply easier. You know, when offered a choice between doing something that's harder and more complicated or something that's easier, we tend to choose the latter. Is that fair to say?
I think that is fair to say. And what we found in our research is that, for example, if you really want to get to know someone and understand them, you would want to choose a medium to talk with them in which you have the richest possible set of cues. So you want to be in person with them, or you want to be on video, or you could talk with them even over the phone. You have a good set of cues over the phone. What you don't want to do is be writing with them, and particularly like in an asynchronous medium, like an email medium. And yet what we find kind of over and over again is that is exactly the medium that people prefer to use and when they think they're going to disagree with someone. And part of that is because they're sort of already anticipating that it'll be a lot of work to have to engage with someone, and they don't think it's worth it on top of that. And so I think that's consistent with that idea.
Right. And do we assume it works both ways, in as much as if you give off the vibe that you couldn't be bothered trying to, truly understand or empathize with somebody that you're dealing with, they will feel the same way about you, and then you're stuck in a feedback loop forever?
Yeah, we call it the self-fulfilling prophecy, that if you think of someone as not being particularly intelligent and not being someone who's going to be willing to listen to you or hear you, then you're not even going to try to talk with them in some meaningful way. You're going to use the medium that's going to be the asynchronous text-based medium that is going to be the most likely to create miscommunication and the least likely to actually intimately understand the other person. And then, of course, that's going to lead them to, not want to engage with you either. And so it's going to create that self-fulfilling prophecy.
This may be a vast overgeneralization, the premise I'm about to put to you, but can we conclude, based on your research, that it tends to be more liberal people from bluer states in the United States who have this kind of, stick their nose up in the air or look down upon people who are perhaps less educated and more conservative and live in redder states? Is that fair to say?
So I do think that there is that stereotype that exists among some of the kind of educated elite, that conservatives in particular, maybe it might be more uneducated and so on. But in general, I would say that what we find is that these processes of default dehumanization occur pretty symmetrically on both sides of the aisle. So we don't have evidence that it's specific to either group or stronger in either group per se.
Really? Because certainly most of what you hear about is that the blue state people had Trump coming to them because they'd spent the previous 5 years or 8 years under Obama sticking their nose up in the air and looking down at so-called flyover country.
Yeah, but I think, we're all humans. We kind of all have the same sort of intuitive psychology about having challenges traversing the distance between other minds. And so I think in that sense, we're kind of all alike.
Got it. What are the types of conditions or triggers that tip people away from seeing people as having lesser minds?
There are two in particular that we focus on in our research. One is the need for connection with someone. So if you have some reason to want to connect with someone, so perhaps they are a family member, or perhaps you have friends in common or something, you're going to be more inclined to try to understand them. Of course, that doesn't always work. Even with family members, you see this disconnect sometimes. But that's one motive. And then another motive is if you care enough to try to understand someone, you have the affectance motive. So for example, if you need them to get something accomplished, that would be another reason why you might that's a trigger that would lead you to engage more deeply with their minds.
All right, speaking of more deeply, let me dive more deeply on this next question, because we've talked about interpersonal communications. We've talked about sort of FaceTime communications or Skype. You've done research on, say, writing and texting versus actually listening to someone speak. What differences have you found?
Yeah, what we find is that it turns out that the voice is very humanizing. So if you hear someone say something that you disagree with, but you can hear it in their own voice, then you're going to be much more likely to think of them as being mentally capable and to actually take what they say seriously, as opposed to if you were to just read the words in text. And so you almost like need that voice to kind of to humanize them again. And it kind of helps to moderate the dehumanizing effects of being across the aisle from someone.
Okay, that makes perfect sense, because what you've basically, unless I'm reading too much into it, it sounds to me like what you're saying is Twitter is almost a perfect social media platform for dehumanizing and expressing more divisive emotions about other people, because you are pretty much only ever reading what other people say as opposed to hearing the voice. Is that right?
That's right. So there are three characteristics of social media and Twitter in particular that make it problematic. So one is that it's text-based and fairly asynchronous. Another is that it uses the public model, which is that there's always an audience present. And so people are often not really communicating with each other deeply. They're communicating to their audience. They're kind of talking past each other. And then the third thing is that any stranger can weigh in. So it's easy for bad actors to get involved. So if there's one bad actor who's very prolific, they can go in and disrupt every single conversation that happens.
So it's a complete toxic stew. Do the people who use Twitter a lot understand that, in your view?
I don't know. I don't know exactly what people think when they use Twitter. I know there are some people who are aware of it, or they learn, as they're using it, that it's not the best model. There's some people that have been able to find some communities within Twitter, but it could be rebuilt in ways that would make it a lot more effective for actually having conversations that are intimate and that allow you to actually understand the minds of other people.
Do you think that's likely to happen with Elon Musk now in charge?
I don't know. I think it's rather unlikely, but we'll see.
Okay, let's finish up on this. People don't talk about their political divisions in the workplace. They don't necessarily talk about it around the dinner table. It's just too dangerous nowadays. Is that a good strategy?
I think that we can have the conversations under a certain set of circumstances that we need to think about. So making sure that when you talk to someone, that you're actually talking to them in a real conversation that, involves the voice. It's actually, in person, or it's on the phone. It's not over, a mediated platform like social media or email. And then also coming in, recognizing that we might have a tendency to assume the worst, and really trying to counteract that and counterbalance it. And there's been some work that has shown that having a set of norms and guidelines that both parties agree to before they get into a conversation can be very helpful. And so whether that's even things like, no name calling, or let's talk about the ideas and not the person, I think those things can help. So I would say under those circumstances, yes, please do try to continue having conversations with people who disagree with you.
Well, I've appreciated this face-to-face conversation with actually very little name calling at all. It's been great. Juliana Schroeder, we want to thank you for joining us on the line from California. It's been great to have you on our program.
Me too. Thanks, Steve.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.